They say every great story starts with a choice, a moment, a decision that, at first glance, feels small, even forgettable. But sometimes those moments hold the power to reshape a life. This is the story of a young man named Elijah, an African-American student who, against the odds, made history simply by being late. And if stories like this inspire you even a little, consider subscribing to the channel. We're on the road to our first 1,000 subscribers, and your support helps us bring more powerful true stories to life. Elijah wasn't a prodigy, nor was he considered gifted by the standards of those around him. He was born in the quiet town of Dayton, Ohio, in the year 1932, during a time when opportunity looked different depending on the color of your skin. His parents were factory workers, firm believers in hard work, discipline, and Sunday church. They didn't have much, but what they lacked in wealth, they made up for in wisdom. From a young age, Elijah was quiet, observant, curious, and full of questions. But life didn't hand him many answers. He was often told what he couldn't do, where he didn't belong. And, in the segregated public school system of the 1940s, gifted black students weren't nurtured, they were overlooked. By the time Elijah reached college age, he had already heard the phrase, "You're not like the others," more times than he could count. Sometimes it was meant as a compliment. Most times it wasn't. Still, he carried those words like invisible weights, silently pushing back against them one step at a time. In 1957, Elijah was accepted into the University of Chicago's mathematics program, a major feat for someone of his background. It wasn't just that he got in. It was what getting in symbolized, a crack in the wall that kept people like him out. He didn't wear fancy clothes or drive a car. He rode the bus with his textbooks on his lap and his dreams tucked deep in his chest. To the outside world he blended into the backdrop, another face in a sea of students, another number on the roll call. But Elijah wasn't here to be average. He just didn't know it yet. One cold Thursday morning in November, Elijah overslept. It wasn't like him. He was known for being early, quiet, respectful. But that morning his alarm didn't ring, and by the time he realized it, he was already 15 minutes late for Professor Hartley's Advanced Statistical Methods class. Racing through the campus, coat flapping in the wind, Elijah barely made it to the old brick building. He stopped at the door, caught his breath, and tried to slip in unnoticed. The professor didn't look up. Students were scribbling notes, and 2 large equations were already chalked onto the blackboard. Thinking he had missed the day's assignment, Elijah quietly jotted the problems down in his notebook, then took out his pencil and tried to catch up. What he didn't know, what nobody could have guessed, was that this moment, this ordinary morning of him being late, would alter not just his life, but the entire field of applied mathematics. Later that night, Elijah stared at the problems. They weren't like the others. The complexity was daunting. His pencil paused often as he reread each line. Maybe I missed the instructions, he thought. Maybe there was something important said before I came in. Still, he didn't ask anyone. He was too proud, or maybe too used to solving things on his own. The next few days were filled with frustration and obsession. He skipped lunch, he barely slept. The problems consumed him like a riddle that mocked him with silence. He filled pages with numbers and graphs, erasing again and again until he found something, a breakthrough. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it worked. At least, he thought it did. And so, on Monday morning, Elijah handed in his notebook like any other assignment. He didn't realize what he had just done. He didn't know that the equations on the board weren't homework at all. They were 2 of the most famous unsolved statistical problems of the 20th century. puzzles that had stumped the brightest minds at Harvard, MIT, and Oxford for decades. Elijah had solved them in his tiny dorm room with a second-hand pencil, a dim desk lamp, and the quiet belief that the only thing standing between him and the answer was trying. The week passed without much incident. Elijah kept his head down, went to classes, and tried not to overthink what he had turned in. It wasn't like he was expecting praise. He was used to going unnoticed. To him, the struggle of those equations was just another part of life, a quiet battle he'd fought and moved on from. But deep inside, a storm was brewing. You see, growing up as a black student in 1950s, America meant walking a tightrope between invisibility and scrutiny. If you failed, you were proof of stereotypes. If you succeeded, people assumed you had help. Either way, you were always being measured, but never fully seen. Elijah had long learned to cope with this paradox. He didn't complain, he just worked harder. But that didn't make the weight any lighter. When he sat in Professor Hartley's class the following week, there was an unusual tension in the air. The professor glanced at him briefly, but said nothing. The equations were gone from the board, replaced with new material. Elijah wondered if maybe he got them wrong, maybe even embarrassingly so. But then came Thursday. "Mr. Elijah Carter," Professor Hartley said as class ended, "please stay behind for a moment." The room emptied slowly, with curious eyes trailing behind. Elijah stood frozen. That familiar tightness returned to his chest. His brain scanned all the possibilities. Did he mess up a formula? Was he being accused of cheating? That wouldn't be new. It had happened before in high school, when his test scores outpaced those of students expected to perform better. Hartley closed the door, walked to his desk, and picked up Elijah's notebook. "I've been teaching for over 30 years, he began, his voice low and deliberate, "and I've seen many assignments. But what you turned in last week, that was not homework." Elijah blinked, unsure how to respond. "I didn't assign those problems," Hartley continued. "They were examples, unsolved problems I referenced in passing at the start of class. Problems that have baffled experts for generations. You weren't here for that part of the lecture, were you?" Elijah shook his head. "No, sir, I was late." There was a long silence. Then something remarkable happened. Professor Hartley smiled, not a smirk, not a condescending grin. A genuine smile, one that said, "I'm impressed," and maybe even, "I underestimated you." "I've shown this to 2 colleagues already," Hartley said. "One of them teaches at Princeton. The other worked with me at Stanford. They both said the same thing. You didn't just stumble into a solution, you understood the question." That night, Elijah sat alone in the university library, notebook in hand. His fingers traced the worn corners of the pages. The words of the professor echoed in his mind, not with pride, but with disbelief. How had this happened? Was it a fluke? Was he just lucky? But deep down, Elijah knew the truth. It wasn't luck. It was years of being forced to be better, sharper, more precise, just to be treated equally. It was years of solving puzzles no one else even noticed, like how to stay safe in a hostile classroom, how to study with second-hand books, how to stay motivated when no one believed in you. Solving those equations wasn't the first miracle Elijah had performed. It was just the first time someone noticed. Over the next few days, whispers began to swirl through the mathematics department. Professors who had never spoken to Elijah before now nodded at him in the hallway. A teaching assistant offered him coffee. One of the senior students asked if he had ever considered graduate school. It was strange. Elijah had never sought attention. His whole life he'd learned to survive by blending in. And now, for the first time, he was being noticed. Not because of who he was, but because of what he had done. And yet, he still didn't understand the true gravity of what was unfolding. Then came the summons. A note was slipped under his dorm door. The handwriting was formal, almost old-fashioned. Elijah Carter, please report to the office of the dean, 10 a.m. sharp. Professor Hartley. He reread the note at least 5 times. His stomach churned. This felt serious, important, potentially dangerous. When he arrived, the secretary at the front desk gave him a soft, knowing smile and gestured toward a door marked Conference Room. He hesitated before turning the knob. Inside sat Professor Hartley, 2 older men in suits, and a woman with thick glasses and a serious expression. The dean sat at the head of the table. "Elijah," the dean said, motioning for him to sit. "You're probably wondering what this is about." Elijah nodded slowly, unsure what to expect. "We've reviewed your solution," the woman said. "All of us, multiple times." Professor Hartley leaned forward. "Elijah, do you understand what you did?" The young man blinked. "I just solved the problems. I thought they were homework." "That's exactly the point," one of the older men interjected. "You solved 2 mathematical conjectures that have remained unresolved for decades, and you did it in less than a week." Elijah sat in stunned silence. "These weren't just difficult," Hartley added. "They were unsolved, as in globally. People at Cambridge, Caltech, and MIT have tried and failed to make sense of them." Elijah's mind reeled. He had solved them only because he didn't know they were unsolvable. Had he known, would he have even tried? That night, he lay awake in his dorm, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened. It hit him hard. The only reason he had attempted those problems was because no one told him he couldn't. What if the greatest barriers in life weren't walls, but signs? Signs telling us, "Don't try. Not for you. Too hard." And what if those signs were wrong? The university moved quickly. A few weeks later, Elijah's work was submitted to a prominent mathematics journal. It was met with both awe and controversy. Some skeptics insisted it had to be a fluke. Others claimed plagiarism until the process was reviewed, line by line, equation by equation. His solution was clean, elegant, original. Soon, newspapers picked up the story. "Black student solves math problems. Experts couldn't crack." He hated that headline, not because he wasn't proud of his background, but because it reduced his work to a miracle of race, not brilliance. But that, too, was a part of the journey. Success, in its purest form, is rarely just celebration. For Elijah, it came wrapped in tension, attention, and the quiet discomfort of suddenly being watched. He wasn't used to the spotlight. He didn't trust it. As media interest grew, reporters knocked on his dorm door. They wanted pictures, quotes, sound bites. Some of them called him a genius. Others labeled him a mathematical prodigy. But none of them knew him. None saw the long nights, the quiet hours, the notebooks filled with doubts and second-guessing. In class, classmates who once ignored him now asked to study together. Professors invited him to private discussions. A prestigious research group sent a letter asking him to consider a summer fellowship. And yet, Elijah felt more alone than ever. One evening, he found himself back in the campus library, in the same seat where he'd worked on the problems. He stared at the stacks of journals around him, all filled with equations he could now understand on a deeper level. He should have felt proud, but instead he felt terrified. Because now that people believed in him, they expected more. And what if that miracle was the only one he had in him? The fear of being a fraud, of not being able to replicate what he'd done, hung over him like a shadow. It's a strange irony of achievement. Sometimes success doesn't lift the pressure, it multiplies it. He tried talking to Professor Hartley about it. "I don't feel like a genius," Elijah admitted. Hartley leaned back in his chair. "That's because you're not, and that's a good thing." Elijah raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You're not a genius, Elijah. You're something better. You're persistent. You try. You care. Geniuses are romanticized, but they burn out. You're sustainable." Elijah let the words sink in. For the first time, he felt seen, not as a fluke, not as a symbol, but as a human being. In the following weeks, Elijah began to rebuild his confidence, not from the outside validation, but from the inside out. He restructured his study habits, not to prove anything to anyone, but to deepen his own understanding. He started tutoring younger students. He took extra classes in logic and abstract theory. And slowly, the fear began to fade. Not because the pressure went away, but because he stopped letting it define him. One afternoon, while grading papers in the math lab, a quiet freshman walked up to him. "Are you Elijah Carter?" Elijah looked up. "Depends who's asking." The student laughed nervously. "I just wanted to say, what you did, it inspired me. I didn't think someone like me could ever belong in a place like this." Elijah smiled gently. "That's what I used to think, too." And in that moment he realized the real miracle wasn't solving those equations. It was what happened afterward, the chain reaction, the shift in perception, the permission it gave others to believe. The spring semester brought with it more than just a change in weather. For Elijah, it brought a whirlwind of recognition that he never asked for, but could no longer avoid. In April, the university announced that Elijah's paper had not only been accepted by the Journal of Theoretical Statistics, but had also been nominated for a National Mathematics Award. His findings were now being referenced in academic circles far beyond Chicago, in lectures at Yale, in conferences in Europe, and in papers authored by men 3 times his age. People had questions. Some wanted to know how a second-year student had done what tenured scholars couldn't. Others subtly probed how he'd even gotten into the university. Some assumed he must have had help, secret tutoring, maybe a hidden mentor. The scrutiny, as always, was sharper for someone who looked like Elijah. He wasn't surprised. He had spent his whole life proving he belonged in rooms that weren't built for him. This was no different, just louder. But there was something else happening too. Other students, especially black and brown students, began reaching out. They started showing up in greater numbers at academic clubs. They sat closer to the front in math lectures. They asked harder questions. They raised their hands, not just to answer, but to be seen. It was as if Elijah's achievement had given them unspoken permission. If he can, maybe I can too. It didn't erase the systemic obstacles, but it shook the belief that they were fixed in place. One day, Elijah received a letter in the mail. No return address. Just a thick envelope with ivory paper. He opened it carefully. It was an invitation to speak at the National Conference of Mathematical Sciences in Washington, D.C. He read it 3 times before believing it was real. Elijah Carter, a 20-year-old who had grown up sharing textbooks and skipping lunch to afford bus fare, was now being asked to lecture at the same podium where Nobel Prize winners once stood. The night before the conference, Elijah sat in his hotel room staring at his speech. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because the moment felt too big for words. He thought about his mother, who used to fall asleep on the sofa, still wearing her work uniform. He thought about his father, who used to write numbers on cardboard scraps when they couldn't afford notebooks. He thought about the teachers who doubted him, the classmates who mocked his accent, the security guards who trailed him through bookstores. And then he thought about the boy who walked into class late one Thursday morning, scribbled down 2 random problems, and unknowingly changed the direction of his life. When Elijah stepped up to the podium the next day, he didn't lead with formulas. He told a story. His story. Not about how smart he was, but about how nobody told him the problems were impossible. And so, he tried. He ended his talk with something simple, something real. Sometimes, what holds us back isn't a wall. It's the idea that a wall is there. The room was quiet for a long second. Then came the applause, and it didn't stop. Years passed. Elijah Carter would go on to become one of the most influential minds in mathematical theory. He published dozens of peer-reviewed papers, contributed to advancements in linear modeling, and held honorary chairs at top universities. He received awards, national medals, international citations, honorary doctorates. His work changed how entire industries approached problem solving. But whenever asked how it all began, he would smile and say the same thing. It started because I was late, and nobody told me I couldn't. Elijah never chased fame. He never built a company, never ran for office. He remained a teacher at heart. Decades after that fateful morning, he returned to the same university, this time as a visiting professor. One rainy afternoon after a lecture, a nervous freshman approached him with a stack of notes and trembling hands. "Professor Carter," the student said, "I'm struggling. I'm not sure I belong here." Elijah looked at the young man and saw himself, the weight, the doubt, the yearning to believe. He took the papers gently and said, "You know, the first time I solved something big, I didn't know it was big. I just thought it was homework." The student blinked, confused, then curious. Elijah continued, "What scares us isn't usually the problem. It's the label we put on it. Impossible. Too late. Not for people like me." Then he smiled. "But those are just stories someone else told you. You get to write your own." Sometimes the greatest achievements aren't born from confidence, but from ignorance of limits. Elijah's story isn't just about math, it's about perception. It's about how often we live in prisons built by ideas, not facts. What if no one told you it was impossible? Would you try? Would you fail harder? Would you perhaps surprise yourself? The truth is, our belief in limits often defines the limits of our belief. And Elijah's journey shows that the most powerful weapon in the world isn't talent. It's the refusal to give up, even when the world never expected you to start. If this story moved you even just a little, if it made you think, feel, or reflect, please consider hitting that subscribe button. We're on a mission to reach our first 1,000 subscribers and bring more untold stories like Elijah's to life. Your support means the world and helps this channel keep growing. Thank you for being here.